Boiling oil and open flames, the kitchens that burned their own cooks. The smell of meat roasting, herbs sizzling in fat, and bread baking in ancient ovens may seem romantic, comforting even. But step back into a medieval kitchen and you'll find anything but comfort. These were not cozy hearths or quaint bakeries. These were fire-lit death traps. Behind the stone walls of castles, manors, and monasteries, medieval kitchens were roaring infernos, and the people who worked there, cooks, scullions, spit boys, were constantly in danger, not from swords or war, but from the very tools they used to prepare feasts for kings. Every day began before dawn. Fires had to be lit and maintained constantly, not with matches or lighters, but with flint and tinder. The hearths were enormous, sometimes stretching across an entire wall, designed to cook for hundreds. Iron cauldrons boiled over the flames, filled with porridge or stew. Above them, hooks suspended joints of meat. Bread ovens were so hot they could sear flesh in seconds. And in the center of it all stood the cook, drenched in sweat, squinting through smoke, and praying the blaze stayed in the hearth. But often, it didn't. One careless spark, one forgotten ember, and the entire kitchen could ignite. Straw mats, wooden beams, and linen garments caught fire easily. Many kitchens were built separate from the main castle or estate, not for the sake of convenience, but to prevent the inevitable kitchen fire from burning everything down. Even then, it wasn't enough. Records show that noble estates and entire abbeys were destroyed in accidental kitchen blazes. Fire was the soul of the kitchen, but it was also its curse. Hot oil was another menace. In recipes that required deep frying, a luxury usually reserved for wealthier houses, rendered fat or oil would be heated in open pans. Temperatures were impossible to regulate. There were no thermometers, no safe fryers, just instinct and proximity. One splash from a spitting pan could blind an eye or melt skin from bone. Scalds were so common that many veteran cooks carried permanent burns across their arms, chests, and faces. They were badges of honor and survival. For those working the spits, the job was both brutal and thankless. Spit boys, often children, would rotate heavy rods with entire animals skewered over the flames. The position required staying still, focused, and close to unbearable heat for hours at a time. Children too close to the flames could faint, or worse, collapse directly into the fire. It happened more than once, and in some tragic accounts, the victims weren't rescued in time. Accidents weren't always just bad luck. Hygiene in the medieval kitchen was poor. Grease caked the stone floors, ashes mixed with spilled broth. If a pot of boiling water was dropped, or a tray of oil overturned, the slick surface turned deadly. Slips led to falls, and falls led to full-body burns. There are written chronicles of kitchen workers slipping directly into boiling cauldrons. In one chilling tale from 14th century France, a cook fell backward into a stew pot during a feast. His screams were drowned by the size of the hall and the noise of celebration. He died before anyone reached him. The stew, it said, was never served, but some guests had already tasted it. The danger wasn't just in the fire. Knives were long, sharp, and crude. Cooks butchered entire animals daily, often in a rush. Without gloves, bandages, or clean water, even a small cut could turn septic. Infections spread fast in these environments. A gash from a cleaver could mean losing a finger or your life. Even skilled cooks bore the evidence of close calls, missing digits, puckered scars, trembling hands. Yet despite all this, the medieval cook was both feared and respected. They were not merely servants. They were alchemists of flame, steel, and taste. Responsible for feeding entire households, they needed to be strong, intelligent, and creative. Recipes weren't written, they were memorized. A master cook could transform bland ingredients into royal dishes, crafting flavors with nothing but instinct and years of survival. To become a head cook meant years of apprenticeship, grit, and luck. You had to outlast the fire, and many didn't. Kitchen mortality was high, though often unrecorded. Most cooks died not from war or plague, but from the very place they labored in every day. Burned, scalded, collapsed from exhaustion, or crippled by infection. Their names don't appear in the grand histories of kings and battles, but they were there, in every castle, behind every feast, sweating and burning behind the scenes. Some kitchens tried to introduce innovations. In monasteries, where record-keeping was more meticulous, rotating systems were sometimes used to prevent burnout. Cooks were rotated out every few weeks. But that didn't erase the danger. It only spread it out. Even with rotating duties, the accidents continued. The fires burned, the oil spilled, and the kitchens claimed their toll. Today, we romanticize the past. We imagine banquets lit by candlelight, tables groaning with roasted game, honey-glazed vegetables, and spiced wine. But few think about the men and boys behind those dishes, the ones who stood inches from death, feeding others while their own bodies broke down. We forget that for every noble's plate, there was a hand, shaking, burned, and scarred, that made it possible. And in the silence of ruined abbey kitchens and crumbling stone hearths, you can still feel it. That heat, that danger, that unspoken history. The kitchens that fed the medieval world also consumed part of it. In smoke, in flame, in sacrifice. The past may be gone, but the scars remain, in the records, in the ruins, and perhaps in the smell of something burning where it shouldn't be. The 16-hour shift. Why medieval cooks never slept through the night. In the heart of every medieval castle, far from the throne room and away from the stained-glass chapels, burned a fire that never went out. It crackled in the deep stone belly of the kitchen, where shadows danced on soot-streaked walls and steam turned the air into breathless fog. Here, time didn't move in hours or days. It moved in fires fed, bread risen, spits turned, and meat reduced to bone. The medieval cook didn't live in the luxury of courts. They lived at the mercy of flame and expectation. And sleep was a luxury they never had. Cooking in a medieval castle wasn't just a job. It was a sentence of endurance, a sentence measured in 16-hour shifts that stretched across the blackened bones of every night. From before the first cock crowed until well after the castle's great hall fell silent, the kitchen staff moved. They moved with aching joints, blistered hands, and the weight of knowing that failure wasn't just inconvenient, it was punishable. Before dawn, the baker began. Long before the castle stirred, the bread ovens needed fire, the dough needed kneading, and the day's leavening had to begin. The oven itself, a massive dome of clay and stone, took hours to heat, and if it cooled too early, the bread was ruined. If it got too hot, it burned. There were no thermostats, only hands placed inside and guesses made from the sting of heat on the skin. And while the baker shaped loaves by lantern light, the cook's assistant, often a young boy or overworked man, was already hauling buckets of water to fill massive cauldrons suspended over open flames. These cauldrons didn't just boil soup, they rendered fat, softened beans, and made medicinal gruels for the ill in the castle's lower chambers. All of it stirred by hand, with wooden paddles the size of oars. As the sun rose, the Lord's breakfast began. Boiled eggs, roasted meats, warmed ale, spiced porridges, all prepared while the kitchen filled with smoke and shouting. And there was no silence. A kitchen in a castle was the pulse of the household, filled with the clang of iron, the hiss of drippings on coals, and the endless sound of labor. There were no breaks. Meals flowed from morning to noon to dusk to late-night suppers. Guests arrived without warning, and the cook had to feed every one of them. Some castles hosted hundreds. During feasts, thousands. Every dish demanded different timing. The spit roast had to turn for hours. Pastries needed chilling. Stews took days to deepen in flavor. Game meat had to be aged, skinned, and cleaned in brutal, bloody precision. Nothing was wasted. Everything smelled. The air reeked of liver, fish, smoke, and death. And in the middle of it all, the cook, elbows deep in blood, worked without sleep. At night, they didn't rest. They prepped for the next day. The embers had to be managed to preserve heat. Leftovers had to be pickled, salted, buried in cold larders, or hung above the smoke. The ovens cooled, but not for long. Every surface needed scraping. Every pot scoured with sand. Rats had to be chased away. Dishes inventoried. And there was fear. Fear of undercooking. Fear of oversalting. Fear of offending a noble's palate. One wrong bite could result in dismissal, or worse, a whipping. Cooks were expendable, replaceable. Their knowledge was passed by word and memory, not books. And yet, their role was irreplaceable. A lord's reputation lived and died on his table. Poisonings, accidental or not, were common. And when suspicion arose, it was the cook who paid first. The cook never ate like a lord. They nibbled while working, swallowed bone-cold scraps when time allowed. They lived in the kitchen or nearby quarters, their skin permanently lined with soot and grease, their backs hunched. Not from age, but from turning meat over flames for 40 years straight. Sleep, it came in bursts, between fire maintenance and meal prep. 2 hours here, a nap while bread baked, a doze while broth simmered if it didn't boil over. And still, they were expected to rise, clean, and serve again. Even the feast days, the days of celebration and plenty, were days of punishment for cooks. More mouths, more pressure, more fire. Imagine a Christmas banquet in a 14th century castle. Dozens of pies, swans stuffed with herbs and spices, loaves shaped into animals, towers of jelly, and fountains of wine. Guests in gowns and furs marveled at the spectacle. But behind the scenes, the kitchen had been awake for 3 days. No exaggeration. Cooks often stayed standing until they fainted. And still, if the crust cracked or the swan's feathers caught fire, it was their fault. They lived in constant noise, no silence, no privacy, no relief. Cooks had no unions, no replacements, no second shifts. Their tools were crude, their knives were worn, and still they invented. Still, they created dishes remembered in manuscripts, recipes etched in ink because they mattered, because they reflected power. And power, in medieval times, meant food. The cook's sleep was transactional, traded for peace in the hall, for the illusion of plenty, for the scent of spice and meat that told every guest, "You are safe, you are full, and this house is strong." But the one who made it happen, they never slept through the night. When the feast went wrong, cooks blamed, beaten, or beheaded. It was a world where power dressed in velvet and gold, where the weight of a nobleman's appetite could crush a man's entire future. In medieval Europe, the grandeur of a feast wasn't just a display of wealth or hospitality, it was a declaration of status, legacy, and control. And in this theater of gluttony and pride, the cooks held the most fragile role of all. Because one wrong turn in the kitchen, meat underdone, ale too warm, bread not risen, could spell more than disappointment. It could mean disgrace, mutilation, or death. Historical records across Europe, especially from the 13th to 15th centuries, recount a recurring and brutal truth. Kitchen staff, particularly head cooks, bore the full weight of the Lord's displeasure. If a feast failed to impress visiting nobles or foreign dignitaries, the kitchen didn't receive a second chance. They received lashes, or exile, or, worse, execution. At the center of this cruelty was the medieval obsession with appearance and power. Food was theater. Roasted swans redressed in feathers, pies that exploded with live birds when opened, and sugar sculptures that resembled castles and mythic beasts were not just meant to be eaten. They were meant to amaze. The Lord's reputation hung on it, and so did the cook's life. In 1387, during a banquet hosted by the Duke of Lancaster, a roasted boar was served undercooked. The boar, seen as the centerpiece of the evening, was expected to be golden, steaming, and richly spiced. Instead, it was pink, tepid, and dry. The Duke, humiliated before his guests, had the head cook dragged out and whipped in the courtyard, stripped of his position, and left penniless. His name doesn't survive in records, but the punishment is carved into the chronicles of the court's humiliations. Other times, the punishment was final. In 1410, a feast prepared for a visiting French noble ended in disaster when a barrel of ale was found to be lukewarm. The ale, stored improperly due to an early frost, was considered an insult to the guest's rank. The cook, despite not being responsible for storage, was sentenced to death. The logic was simple. If the food failed, someone must pay. And the cook was the closest scapegoat. But it wasn't always the lords who imposed these punishments. Sometimes it was the staff themselves. Kitchen hierarchies were ruthless. The head cook, or master cook, oversaw dozens of assistants. If a scullion boiled something too long, or a spitboy turned the meat too slowly, it could ruin a course. The master cook's neck was on the line, and to save it, he often beat or blamed his inferiors. One misstep could ignite a chain reaction of fear and violence below the stairs. The pressure led many cooks to adopt cruel regimens within their kitchens. Some trained apprentices with threats and humiliation, instilling in them not only recipes, but the terror of failure. Cooks were known to taste food obsessively, smell meat every few minutes, and inspect ale casks for the slightest variation in temperature. This was not perfectionism. It was survival. Even kings weren't above such brutality. King Edward III of England reportedly beheaded a cook after a banquet went wrong. While the exact offense is debated, some accounts claim it was spoiled venison, others say the dessert collapsed. The punishment was swift and theatrical. The cook was executed publicly, both to satisfy the king's fury and to send a message. This was a realm where even taste could kill. The psychology behind this cruelty was deeply rooted in medieval values. In a world with no media, no internet, and few books, food was one of the few ways to impress, intimidate, and exert dominance. A feast gone wrong wasn't just a bad meal, it was political sabotage. A cold dish could be interpreted as a slight, a poorly timed course, a sign of disrespect. Guests whispered, alliances fractured, reputations plummeted, and so the cook, though hidden from the dining hall, became a pivotal, dangerous figure. Yet despite the terror they lived under, some cooks rose to prominence. The famed Taillevent, a 14th-century French cook, wrote Les Viandiers, a cookbook that still survives today. He cooked for Charles V of France and was known to orchestrate elaborate feasts with hundreds of dishes. He once served roasted peacocks with their feathers reattached and shimmering in gold foil. But even Taillevent wasn't immune. He was once imprisoned over a culinary mishap, though released shortly after. Fame could delay punishment, but not erase the threat. There's also evidence that some cooks tried to manipulate the system. They would bribe food tasters or flatter stewards to ensure they weren't blamed. Some even developed test meals served to lower staff hours before the feast, so they could detect problems in advance. But if something went wrong despite all precautions, there was no appeal, no second plate, no forgiveness. In 1483, at a banquet for the coronation of King Richard III, a dessert tray collapsed just before being served. While it was a servant who had tripped, the pastry cook responsible for the tiered display was flogged, dismissed, and exiled from the castle kitchens forever. It didn't matter that the fall was accidental. Perfection was the law. And law, in those kitchens, was enforced with violence. These stories are not scattered folklore. They're documented in royal court records, estate ledgers, and the margins of personal journals. In the shadow of medieval splendor, the kitchen was a crucible of cruelty. It wasn't about hospitality. It was about power. And the easiest person to crush was the one holding the ladle. So the next time you imagine a medieval banquet, a hall of laughter, music, golden goblets, and towering platters, pause for a moment. Behind those doors, in the smoke-choked heat of the kitchen, someone was sweating not just from labor, but from fear. Someone knew that one wrong flavor could lead to chains, one burned pie could end in blood, and somewhere in the flicker of torchlight, a young apprentice stirred the pot, silently praying that tonight, just tonight, nothing would go wrong, because if it did, it would not be forgiven. It would be punished, harshly, and history would remember the feast, but not the hand that bled to serve it. Meat rot and maggots. Cooks forced to prepare spoiled food. Imagine the scent of rotting flesh, sweet, sharp, unmistakably foul, drifting through the halls of a royal kitchen. Before refrigeration, before modern preservation, meat was a ticking clock. And in medieval courts and early modern kitchens, it was often already spoiled before the fire was lit. But the feast had to go on. Cooks were expected to mask the decay with spices, wine, or vinegar, and if they failed, it wasn't just the guests who suffered. The cook could be beaten, dismissed, or, in some cases, executed. This was not an isolated problem. Across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, the absence of refrigeration meant that meat began decomposing as soon as the animal died. In the heat of summer, flesh could spoil within hours. Even in cooler climates, transportation delays or poor butchering meant that what arrived in the kitchen was crawling, sometimes literally, with decay. Meat could be green, slime-covered, riddled with worms, and yet it had to be served. In large estates and royal courts, a hierarchy of responsibility existed. The master cook oversaw the operation, but it was often apprentices and scullery boys who had to handle the worst, scraping away the most rotten parts, brushing off maggots, dousing meat in salt or vinegar in desperate attempts to halt the rot. The most common tactic? Spices. Heavy, overpowering spices. Pepper, clove, nutmeg, and ginger weren't just for taste. They were tools of deception. Their cost was high, but nobility often valued appearance over safety. A beautifully presented dish could hide the stench of decay if disguised well enough. In the 14th and 15th centuries, many cook's manuals, such as Le Viandier or The Form of Curie, included elaborate spice mixes. These weren't just for flavor, they were survival guides. Recipes included phrases like, to cover foul flesh, or to make sweet what is sour. And for those who could afford it, the addition of dried fruit, honey, and wine masked rot further. But underneath the glaze, the danger remained. Food poisoning was common and deadly. E. coli, salmonella, and botulism, unseen killers, claimed lives often. But knowledge of bacteria did not yet exist. Illness was blamed on imbalance, bad air, or demonic influence, and when a nobleman fell sick, suspicion turned quickly to the kitchen. The line between rotten food and poison was thin. A single misstep by a cook could result in banishment, torture, or worse. There are records of entire kitchens being punished for a spoiled dish. In 1521, during the reign of Francis I of France, a banquet resulted in the illness of several guests. The meat had been prepared late, and though doused in a mixture of red wine and cloves, the spoilage wasn't masked well enough. The head cook was jailed, and his assistants were flogged publicly, not because they intended harm, but because they failed to hide the truth. And this wasn't limited to the elite. In cities, meat markets were infamous for their smell. Butchers sold questionable cuts, sometimes treating them with ash or urine to reduce odor. Laws were passed requiring meat inspections, but corruption made enforcement inconsistent. A poor family might eat meat that had sat in open air for days. Children often fell ill. Death by dinner wasn't rare, it was expected. Even traveling armies weren't spared. Soldiers were fed salted meat that had spoiled in barrels. Mold and maggots were scraped off. Hunger overruled disgust. In the journals of 17th century British soldiers, there are accounts of troops forced to cook meat they describe as blue and bubbling. Illness spread fast, and yet it was considered a necessary risk. It's easy to romanticize the past, lavish feasts, golden goblets, the scent of roasted boar filling great halls. But what you don't see are the hidden efforts behind the spectacle. The kitchen boy vomiting behind the smokehouse, the apprentice gagging as he scrapes slime from pork, the cook kneeling in prayer before service, hoping the meat doesn't kill someone tonight. The fear wasn't just for the guests. In many noble houses, the cook tasted every dish first. If they collapsed, the meal was stopped. If they lived, service continued. Imagine the pressure. Every bite could be your last. Every flavor, a test of your survival instinct. We often think of food as comfort, but in the pre-refrigeration world, food was threat. Cooks lived in constant dread, not only of illness, but of punishment. If a guest suspected anything wrong, the cook was guilty until proven innocent. Spices were not luxury. They were defense, a shield, a way to buy a little time before the rot caught up. And yet, the craft evolved. Cooks became masters of disguise. Rotten meat was boiled, shredded, turned into pies where spices and pastry concealed all. Recipes disguised decay so well that some even found them delicious. The line between survival and delicacy blurred. What started as necessity became tradition. Some of these traditions remain. The heavily spiced meat dishes of certain regions are remnants of this era. Modern people may enjoy them without realizing their origin, a desperate attempt to cover decay. So next time you taste cloves in a stew or cinnamon in a roast, remember this. It might not be a flavoring. It might be a warning, a relic of a time when cooks didn't season for delight, but for survival. Because once, in kitchens lit by fire and shadow, when the meat smelled sweet and the danger sweeter, death came not with a sword, but on a silver platter. The Rat Wars. How medieval cooks fought to keep food from vermin. They weren't just battling fire and famine. In the dark recesses of medieval kitchens, beneath the clatter of ladles and the hiss of boiling broth, another enemy lurked, silent, cunning, and relentless. Rats. Not the occasional scuttling visitor, but a nightly siege of whiskered invaders drawn by the scent of grain, dripping meat, and freshly baked bread. This was the hidden war that cooks never spoke of in royal halls, but fought with every ounce of desperation after the lords had feasted. In grand castles and crowded manors alike, vermin were a plague in more ways than one. Rats weren't simply a nuisance. They were disease vectors, carriers of fleas that spread the bubonic plague. A rat-infested kitchen wasn't just unhygienic. It was a death sentence in slow motion. And yet, they kept coming. Through cracks in the stone, under cellar doors, along the ropes of food hoists, even inside the walls themselves. Medieval kitchens were never still. The fires rarely went out. Stews simmered overnight, bread rose in the warmth, and barrels of grain lined the storage rooms. But the abundance was both bounty and bait. As day fell and candles burned low, the rats emerged. Dozens, sometimes hundreds. Their claws clicked on stone floors. Their teeth shredded cloth sacks. They gnawed through loaves, nibbled raw meat, and left behind trails of droppings and disease. To the noble upstairs, the feast seemed effortless. But for the cooks below, every plate was hard won. At night, they set iron traps baited with lard or offal. Some wielded boiling pots, flinging hot water into corners where the rodents nested. Cats were essential staff, not pampered pets, but feral killers trained by necessity. A good Mauser could earn a cook's gratitude and perhaps even a scrap of meat from the table. And still, it wasn't enough. The problem wasn't only in the kitchens. Rats chewed through flour sacks in mills, infested ships carrying spice cargo, and traveled hidden in hay carts from one town to the next. They adapted faster than the solutions invented to stop them. In some kitchens, cooks slept in shifts, half awake, armed with sticks or makeshift cudgels, just to guard the bread ovens. If rats got to the dough, the whole batch had to be thrown out, and throwing food away in an age of famine was almost sacrilege. The Black Death only worsened the paranoia. As plague swept across Europe in waves, any sign of rat infestation was treated like an omen. Cooks began boiling their tools at dawn, scalding the floors, burning rat corpses when found, and burying contaminated food deep beyond the castle walls. Rats, it was said, could smell wealth, and where there was food, they multiplied. But they weren't just drawn to the food, they were part of the ecosystem of medieval life, a dark, unwanted shadow that followed humanity everywhere it went. Rat catchers became a profession in and of themselves. In towns and near large manors, some men were paid in coin and leftovers to patrol granaries and pantries. Armed with nets, dogs, and even crude poisons, they battled infestations that could cripple a kitchen's ability to function. And yet, they too fell victim to the diseases their prey carried. Some wore leather masks or tied herbs around their necks, believing it might purify the air, but none of it truly worked. Even monasteries, places known for cleanliness and discipline, weren't immune. Rats gnawed the bindings of manuscripts and stole crumbs from sacred communion bread, and in those echoing stone kitchens where monks prepared simple meals, the war continued. With prayers whispered by candlelight, traps set behind altar cellars, and walls stuffed with straw to block tiny intruders. There are records, forgotten side notes in household accounts, where cooks were docked pay or punished for spoiled or missing ingredients. And when lords blamed illness or foul taste on bad food, the cause wasn't always a mistake in spice or fire. Sometimes it was a rat's bite on a crust, missed in haste, and served on gold plate. In rare cases, even royal kitchens faced scandal. When food for kings was found chewed or a guest fell sick, investigations swept through the cook staff like wildfire. Some were beaten, others dismissed without notice, and a few unlucky ones were executed, made examples of, even if they were only guilty of losing to an impossible enemy. The rat wars didn't make it into the tapestries. They weren't recorded in song, but they shaped how food was stored, how kitchens were designed, and how the culture of cleanliness slowly took root in Europe. From raised platforms to store grain off the ground to the hiring of night guards in large households, every small change was a response to vermin. Not because people suddenly grew fond of hygiene, but because they were tired of dying from what they couldn't see. By the late Middle Ages, iron-reinforced granaries became more common. Barrels were sealed tighter. Cats were bred for temperament and killing instinct. And in some regions, the use of peppermint, mint, or camphor oil was recommended around pantry doors. Primitive deterrents passed down as folk wisdom. Still, the rats survived. They always did. But so did the cooks. Scraping, swatting, boiling, burning, fighting a war no one ever praised them for. The dishes on a nobleman's table were more than culinary achievements. They were acts of resistance, born of sleepless nights and claw-marked walls, a victory over hunger and over the tide of disease carried by tails and teeth in the dark. Behind every roasted pheasant, every glazed pie, every steaming loaf of bread, there's a forgotten battlefield, one lined with rat bones, claw marks, and the quiet determination of cooks who refused to let vermin win. Because in the medieval world, survival wasn't just about food. It was about keeping it safe from the plague, from spoil, and from the swarm that came after the sun went down. This was the hidden war beneath the banquets, the unseen victory between man and pest, played out night after night in the fire-lit silence of the kitchen's underworld. The fish day's nightmare, cooking without meat for 200 days a year. The calendar didn't just mark time in medieval Europe, it dictated the very flavors of life. And for hundreds of years, it told cooks this simple truth: today, there is no meat. Not because it ran out, not because the butcher failed to deliver, but because God and the Church said no. Across monasteries, castles, and peasant homes, nearly 200 days of the year were designated as fish days or fasting days. On these days, consuming the flesh of warm-blooded animals was forbidden. No beef, no pork, no poultry. And for the cooks of the medieval world, it wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a nightmare. Imagine being tasked with feeding a royal court, a monastery of monks, or even your own family. And being told half the ingredients you normally rely on are off limits. No rich beef stock to deepen a stew, no roasted chickens to satisfy hunger, no animal fats to fry or preserve. Cooks had to reinvent the idea of flavor under a strict and punishing code of religious abstinence, and they did it not for a week or a season, but for over half the year. This wasn't about health, it wasn't about economics, it was about the soul. The church's rules around fasting were designed to curb indulgence, to remind people of sacrifice. Wednesdays, Fridays, Lent, Advent, the eve of certain saints' days, and nearly every major religious observance, these were fish days. The idea was simple: deny the body to cleanse the spirit. But while priests preached restraint, cooks were left to solve a problem that would test their skills, patience, and sanity. And so, a bizarre culinary revolution was born. The kitchen became a laboratory of substitutions. Meat was replaced with fish, but not the tender salmon or sea bass you might imagine. Most medieval communities were landlocked. Fresh fish was a luxury, reserved for the rich and the coastal. Inland cooks relied on preserved options: barrels of salted herring, dried cod known as stockfish, smoked eel, or pickled lampreys. These ingredients were tough, pungent, and often hard to disguise. To compensate, cooks turned to almonds, not for snacking, but for milk. Almond milk became the fasting world's answer to cream. Soaked, ground, and strained, it was used in everything from stews to sauces to desserts. It gave body to soups, acted as a substitute for dairy, and even found its way into mock white meat dishes. In some cases, almond paste was sculpted into the shape of roast birds, then decorated with vegetable-based dyes to mimic the real thing. Fasting didn't always mean minimalism. In wealthier households, it meant deception. And then there were the eels. Slimy, boneless, and serpentine, eels were the fasting delicacy of choice for centuries. They were considered a fish by church law, though they often resembled something from a nightmare. Still, they were abundant in European rivers, easy to preserve, and endlessly versatile. Roasted eel, jellied eel, eel pies, eel stews. If there was a way to cook them, medieval cooks found it. In noble kitchens, recipes became elaborate, with multiple steps and layered flavors to make eels feel like a treat, not a punishment. But for cooks, the pressure was immense. Nobles didn't want to taste penance. They wanted indulgence disguised as virtue. Monks wanted sustenance to survive long hours of prayer and labor. Even peasants, though they had fewer ingredients, grew tired of the same preserved fish and wanted something more. The cook became a magician, conjuring flavor from limitations, coaxing pleasure from abstinence. Mistakes were costly. Fasting rules were serious. In some cases, accidentally serving meat on a fish day could result in harsh punishment, especially in monastic kitchens. There are records of monks being flogged for breaking fast, even when it was unintentional. Cooks bore the blame. They were expected to memorize the church calendar, adapt menus for every feast and vigil, and ensure not a drop of forbidden fat entered the pot. Some even devised separate utensils and pots just for fasting food, centuries before modern dietary separation. Yet ingenuity thrived in constraint. New recipes emerged. Pea and lentil purees mimicked the richness of meat. Root vegetables were layered with herbs and vinegar to create depth. Mushrooms, often called poor man's meat, took center stage in peasant meals. In royal kitchens, fasting became an opportunity to showcase culinary artistry. There are surviving cookbooks from the period listing dozens of fish day dishes, many more complex than their meat-based counterparts. But none of it was easy. The mental toll on cooks, especially those working without refrigeration or modern preservation, was immense. They had to work with whatever the market or monastery seller could provide. Sometimes that meant spoiled fish. Sometimes it meant grinding stale bread into pastes to stretch a dish. And always, it meant keeping the fire going, even when the spirits of the kitchen were running cold with fatigue. In some stories, cooks rebelled quietly. Recipes were hidden in code. A dish named innocently as fasting loaf might hide animal lard under the guise of exotic spice. A few bold cooks risked substituting eggs or butter, hoping no one would notice. But if they were caught, it wasn't just their job on the line, it was their soul. Over the centuries, fasting laws evolved. Some areas relaxed the rules, others grew stricter. But for a long, grim stretch of medieval time, the kitchen lived under the shadow of the church calendar. And cooks had to become masters, not just of flavor, but of survival, of substitution, of silence. They bore the weight of invisible laws, and did so with burned hands, sleepless eyes, and hearts pounding from the next holy day approaching. So next time you hear about fasting or a meatless recipe, remember it wasn't always a choice. For the medieval cook, it was a sentence to creativity, a sentence to danger, a sentence to a kitchen filled not with the scent of roast meat, but with smoke, salt, almond, and fear. And still, they cooked, because they had to, because hunger didn't fast. Poisoned ingredients. When cooks were accused of treason. In the medieval world, food was more than nourishment. It was politics, it was trust, and it was danger. A meal could elevate a man to glory or send him to the grave, and at the center of that risk stood one person, tired, stained, and often terrified, the castle cook. In an age where the line between healing and harming was razor thin, even the most loyal servant could become a traitor with a single mistake. Because when a nobleman fell ill after a meal, the first question asked was never, "What happened?" It was, "Who cooked it?" And the answer almost always pointed toward the kitchen. Not all poisonings were deliberate, but intention never mattered. If a lord's stomach turned, if his face paled, if his pulse slowed, the weight of suspicion fell like a guillotine. Cooks were dragged out of their quarters, interrogated, beaten, and in many cases, hanged, whether they meant harm or not. The kitchen was a place of smoke, sweat, and constant guessing. Herbs hung in bunches above the fireplace, some medicinal, some lethal. Leaves were dried and crushed without labels. Roots looked identical. A few stray foxglove petals in a stew could stop a heart. Hemlock in a salad could end a dynasty. Even the wrong mushroom, gathered with the best intentions, could end in convulsions and silence. And it didn't help that medieval science was, at best, guesswork. Spoiled meat was common. Salt was expensive. Refrigeration didn't exist. Food could be infected with mold or worms or invisible illness. Nobles wanted exotic flavors, spices from the East, dried fruits from far ports, sauces thickened with questionable ingredients. And if one of them became ill, the explanation was rarely logic. It was betrayal. Cooks were easy targets. They were low-born, usually uneducated, and utterly disposable. In some kingdoms, they were treated with the same suspicion as alchemists or spies. An accusation didn't need evidence, only a moaning noble and a finger pointed downward. Punishment was swift, trials were rare, and poison was feared more than daggers. In 1387, a cook in Rouen was executed after the son of a local lord died from fevered bowels. The boy had consumed a dish of cold game meat. The real cause? Likely foodborne bacteria from unwashed hands or a contaminated pot. But the father didn't wait for proof. The cook was bound, displayed, and thrown into a river. In the royal courts of England and France, cooks were often monitored by guards. Food tasters were appointed not to test for taste, but for toxins. Meals were sampled under watchful eyes. Entire staffs could be replaced after a single illness. Suspicion didn't stop at individuals. It infected kitchens like smoke. A single misstep by one assistant could doom them all. And yet, most of these cooks weren't saboteurs. They were artisans, scientists in the shadows. They understood more about preservation and fermentation than the doctors of their day. They cured meats with salt and ash. They boiled bones for hours to extract marrow. They sweetened sour berries into glazes and masked rot with saffron. They knew the power of parsley, and the threat of belladonna. But knowledge wasn't protection. A nobleman's trust was brittle. His health was sacred. If his pulse failed, someone had to answer. Even if the sickness came from spoiled wine or airborne illness, the hand that stirred the pot bore the blame. Fear haunted every kitchen. It shaped every recipe. It turned caution into obsession. Some cooks kept private notebooks, hidden under loose floorboards or wrapped in oilcloth, documenting every meal, every batch, every spice used, and why. These records weren't culinary. They were legal defense. Some castles went so far as to build isolated kitchens, separate from the main hall, with guarded hallways and only one key, often held by a steward who watched every step. Trust was a currency, and cooks, no matter how skilled, were forever in debt. In the courts of Italy, the threat of poisoning was so great that popes had entire secret kitchens. The papal cook wasn't just a servant, he was watched like a prisoner. In some years, cooks changed weekly to prevent conspiracies. In others, they were monks, sworn under vows of silence and obedience. Still, suspicion lingered. Because death, when it came, was fast and tasted like dinner. There are records of cooks being flayed, drawn, even boiled alive, publicly, to make a point. "Don't touch the table of power," the punishment whispered. "Don't make mistakes," even if that mistake was a herb that grew too close to its poisonous cousin, even if it was a batch of almonds stored too long and gone bitter with natural cyanide. It wasn't just the nobles who suffered, servants too. Entire wings of a household could fall sick, and with them, the whispers spread. Was it carelessness? Was it treason? Was the cook angry? Had they been bribed? Did they want revenge? Fear turned kitchens into war zones, and yet they had to keep feeding. Day after day, night after night, shifts without end. Fire never cold, hands never clean, and minds never at peace. Because in the medieval world, food wasn't just sustenance, it was suspicion. And when the wrong ingredient slipped in, by error or by fate, the cook was the first to hang. The cauldron collapses, cooks crushed. By their own equipment, in the echoing stone belly of a medieval kitchen, where shadows danced with flame and the scent of roasting meat clung to the walls, there loomed a monster more dangerous than any knife or open fire: the cauldron. Not the kind used for storybook potions or witches' brews, but real ones, iron-bellied, fire-blackened, and monstrously heavy. These vessels were the heart of the medieval feast, used to feed entire castles, armies, or festivals. And when they failed, when a rope frayed, a hook snapped, or a fire shifted, they didn't simply fall, they destroyed. These cauldrons weren't quaint cooking pots. Many were the size of bathtubs, weighing over 200 kilograms even when empty. Filled with water, meat, vegetables, and grain, they could easily exceed 600 kilograms, more than enough to crush bones and cave skulls. Hoisted above roaring fires by iron tripods or suspended with chains from blackened ceiling beams, they balanced precariously over heat that never ceased. Cooking in a medieval kitchen meant gambling with weight, steam, and time. The very design of these kitchens made accidents likely. Floors were often damp with grease or slippery with blood. The air was thick with smoke, clouding vision and stinging eyes. Add to that the heat, intolerable by modern standards, and the frantic pace required to prepare 10 or more courses for noble guests, and you have a perfect recipe for disaster. Historical records are grimly clear about what happened when cauldrons failed. In 1329, the Chronicle of Tewkesbury Abbey recounts how 3 kitchen servants died instantly when a cauldron chain broke during a royal banquet. The iron pot plummeted into the hearth, splashing boiling stew across the workers nearby. 2 more lingered in agony for days before succumbing to their burns. No repairs were made. The next feast went on schedule. In some castles, cauldrons were maneuvered using pulley systems rigged through ceiling beams. These systems relied on leather or rope, both vulnerable to wear, heat, and rats. If the pulley failed, there was no warning. only the thunderous crack of rope giving way and the screaming of men too slow to leap aside. A falling cauldron didn't just crush, it scalded, it seared, it broke bones and then cooked the flesh beneath. One of the deadliest aspects was the boiling contents. Water used for stews or grain cooking could reach over 100 degrees in tightly enclosed cauldrons. When spilled, the liquid clung to skin, saturating clothing and making it impossible to escape the burn. Survivors were rare, and those who lived bore lifelong disfigurements, scarred hands, melted ears, twisted arms. Some were forced to wear cloth wrappings for the rest of their shortened lives, relegated to roles away from sight, hidden from the nobility who once dined on their labor. Accounts from France describe cooks with missing limbs, eyes blinded by hot splashes, or skin bubbled by steam when a lid fell open. One 14th century noblewoman reportedly refused to let a maimed cook serve in her kitchen, calling him a wretch unfit for appetite. His injuries weren't a badge of courage, they were considered a stain on her table's beauty. Sometimes, the accident wasn't equipment failure, but fatigue. Cooks, often working 16-hour days with few breaks, grew weak. Hands slipped on slick pot handles. Feet caught on coals. One misstep could tilt a cauldron just enough to tip its contents. A scullion in the court of Edward III reportedly lost his footing while lifting a pot of boiling ale. It landed on another boy's back. The boy died before morning. The scullion was beaten for clumsiness and demoted. What made these deaths all the more horrifying was their silence in public discourse. Nobles might bemoan a ruined dish or delayed course, but the names of the injured rarely made it past the kitchen walls. Cooks were tools. Their pain was part of the price of elegance. When a cauldron fell, it was replaced before the fire cooled. And yet, cooks knew the risks. They watched their peers collapse from exhaustion or scream under burns. Still, they came back to the hearth. Why? Because a kitchen role was a rare chance at upward mobility. A talented cook might one day serve directly under a master chef or be assigned to the Lord's traveling court. For those born into poverty, this was the only ladder, and it was slick with blood and sweat. Some tried to engineer better systems. Stone platforms were sometimes used instead of hanging cauldrons, lowering the chance of collapse. Others lobbied for iron stands instead of rope suspensions. But in many smaller manors and rural halls, cost mattered more than safety. As late as the 16th century, rope was still being used to hoist pots in lesser noble households, despite centuries of lethal accidents. The survivors adapted in quiet ways. Gloves stitched with wool or leather were used, though few could afford them. Wooden paddles allowed cooks to stir from a distance, but only if the kitchen had enough wood to spare. And every cook, whether master or apprentice, learned to listen for the groan of a beam, the squeak of a rope, or the unnatural hiss of a shifting flame. These weren't just sounds, they were warnings. So when you picture a medieval feast, its dancers and musicians, roasted meats and glittering goblets, don't forget the unseen battle that raged behind the scenes, not of knives and fire, but of crushing weight and scalding chaos. Where a misstep didn't ruin a meal, it ended a life. And when the cauldron collapsed, it didn't just break metal, it broke men. The kind you never read about in the stories, because their names were swallowed by the fire that fed the feast. Ovens that exploded. The deadly risks of bread baking. In the quiet morning hours of medieval life, before the market bells rang and roosters called, the bread oven roared to life. But this roaring was not always tame. In an age where fire was both salvation and curse, baking bread could be a fatal act, because behind the scent of fresh loaves lay a hidden danger: sealed ovens, glowing coals, and pressure chambers waiting to erupt. Medieval bread ovens, if mishandled, didn't just fail, they exploded. These ovens were architectural beasts, massive, dome-shaped furnaces made of stone and clay. To bake bread, they were filled with dry kindling and hot coals, stoked until the interior glowed with residual heat. Once hot enough, the fire was raked out and the bread placed inside. But there was a catch. The oven had to be sealed. And sealing wasn't simple. Bakers used thick slabs of wood, animal skins, or packed mud to close the mouth of the oven. In some places, damp clay was molded into the cracks, sealing heat inside. The problem was that this process turned ovens into primitive pressure cookers. Without proper venting, gases built up from burning wood, evaporating moisture, and expanding air. If sealed too tightly, or if the structural clay had weakened with age, the oven could burst outward with deadly force. Manor records from across Europe tell the same story in different forms. A woman in Lincolnshire was killed instantly when her community oven exploded in 1319. The cause? A vent left plugged by accident. In a French abbey, an entire wall of the bakery collapsed during a feast preparation in 1446. 2 apprentices were found burned, one hurled several feet by the force of the blast. These were not freak accidents. They were common enough to be recorded in law. In fact, some medieval townships required bakers to post notices when using public ovens. In cities like Florence or York, bread ovens were often shared and surrounded by homes. An explosion didn't just injure bakers. It could collapse stone walls, ignite roofs, and send shrapnel of hot brick and wood flying into bystanders. The risk was so great that bakers were sometimes forced to pay for repairs or face fines if deaths occurred. But why didn't they build them safer? The answer lies in necessity. Bread was a staple, and ovens needed to retain heat as long as possible. That meant thick walls, minimal ventilation, and aggressive sealing methods. Most villages had a single oven for dozens of families. It was used in rotation, packed with loaves, then shut for hours. Time was precious. If a baker rushed the heating or misjudged moisture content, steam could accumulate faster than expected, cracking the clay from within. And not all the danger was structural. Carbon monoxide buildup from insufficient ventilation was another killer. Bakers who lingered too long during the heating phase, especially in winter when windows were shut, sometimes collapsed without ever knowing why. Their breath slowed, their vision blurred. They slumped beside the fire they tended and never stood again. Medieval baking was an art, yes, but it was also warfare against time, temperature, and unseen pressure. Cooks relied on instinct. They judged heat by the color of the stone, moisture by scent, pressure by the sound of the oven's creak. There were no thermometers, no safety valves, just tradition, experience, and luck. Sometimes, bakers heard faint groans from their ovens, wood or clay expanding. When that sound came, they stepped back. Everyone did, because they knew what might follow: a burst, a roar, a split-second flash of fire and flying earth. If you were lucky, it missed. If not, you were scarred or gone. Even smaller explosions left behind horrors. Children sent to fetch bread would return with burns or stories of the oven coughing smoke. Cracked stones revealed the force held inside. And yet, every morning, the ovens were fired again. This was the heartbeat of medieval life. Bread was not just food, it was survival. And so, risks were taken. Apprentices were trained with fear and reverence. Old bakers taught the art of sealing and venting with solemnity. Bread wasn't just kneaded and shaped, it was prayed over, not just for rise and crust, but for safe return. Some ovens were eventually rebuilt with chimneys and small side vents. These innovations, however, were slow to spread. Most peasants and townsfolk used traditional, dangerous models well into the Renaissance. The knowledge passed slowly, and accidents remained. What's left today are the records: charred walls, scorch marks in manor kitchens, forgotten names in coroner ledgers, the lives lost to something as simple as a loaf. In a world without machines, where muscle and flame met every day, even bread demanded blood. And still, the act of baking continued. It had to. For those in servitude or working in manorial kitchens, Refusal to bake out of fear wasn't an option. It was dereliction. The noble tables had to be filled. The household had to eat. The oven, dangerous or not, had to be fired. Some even saw it as a rite of endurance. Apprentices were not considered ready until they'd faced the oven's fury and returned with whole loaves and whole skin. Superstition crept in, too. In some villages, charms were hung above ovens, patterns etched into the clay, believed to ward off spirits that made ovens angry. Prayers were whispered before sealing the door. Some claimed that if the dough rose too fast, the oven had become restless. These were coping mechanisms, human responses to a very real, lethal risk. Today, we turn a knob. A light clicks. Heat comes clean, measured, safe. But the oven hasn't always been a friend. In the old world, it was a beast in the wall, fed wood and sweat, speaking in cracks and moans, and all too ready to take life along with it. And so, as you slice into your bread, golden and soft, pause to imagine the hands that once shaped loaves while standing before a furnace that might collapse or explode. Bread has always nourished us, but once it asked for courage in return. Bread. Riots and blame. Cooks targeted during famine. Uprisings. The fire didn't always start in the hearth. Sometimes it began in the streets, angry voices rising like smoke, carrying with them the scent of desperation. In medieval Europe, bread wasn't just food, it was life. It filled bellies, quieted children, and sustained laborers. So when the bread vanished, when the oven sat cold and empty, something far more dangerous than hunger took its place: rage. Famine was a recurring shadow across the Middle Ages. Crops failed, weather turned, wars tore fields apart. But no matter the cause, when grain ran low and flour grew scarce, communities turned to the only visible symbol of abundance: the castle kitchen. And for many, it was the cooks who bore the blame. Inside the great stone walls of manors and keeps, fires still burned. Servants still scurried. The rich still dined, perhaps not in full feasts, but in meals far more substantial than the crusts outside. To starving peasants, the scent of roasting meat or the smoke from a chimney meant one thing: they're eating, and we're not. It didn't matter that noble kitchens were often under ration orders, too. The image was enough. The cook, once invisible behind walls and steam, became a symbol of cruelty. A target. Bread riots were not rare. In cities and villages across France, England, Italy, and beyond, records tell of crowds storming bakeries, granaries, and manor kitchens. When bellies were empty for too long, law broke down. In 1329, a riot in Paris erupted after rumors spread that flour was being hidden from the poor. Bakers fled. In some areas, townspeople forced doors open with logs and stones, dragging out anyone associated with food production. Cooks, seen as agents of hoarding, were pulled from kitchens and beaten, sometimes to death. These weren't organized revolutions. They were eruptions of grief and starvation. Women holding children with sunken eyes, men with calloused hands, trembling not from violence but from days without nourishment. And in the center of that rage, any sign of luxury became an offense. A kitchen fire was an insult. A full storeroom was a betrayal. And a cook, no matter how lowly their rank, became a stand-in for the lords who hid behind tapestries and locked doors. One account from the English famine of 1315 to 1317 tells of a manor cook in Lincolnshire who was seized during a riot after villagers discovered barley hidden for noble use. They didn't know he hadn't made the decision to store it. They didn't care. He was beaten unconscious and hung by his apron strings from the manor gate. The lord survived. The cook did not. There's irony in this scapegoating. Most cooks were barely above servant rank. Many were poor themselves, laboring endlessly for food they couldn't eat, preparing dishes they would never taste. In some kitchens, cooks slept on straw beneath tables, exhausted from 16-hour days. Their loyalty was not to the nobility, it was to the rhythm of the fire. Yet when the world burned, they burned with it. Rioters weren't always random. They came with purpose. Some demanded open granaries, others insisted on fair prices. In many cities, women led the charge, not just as mothers, but as the ones who understood hunger most intimately. Bread was their daily ritual. When it disappeared, they didn't march. They stormed. They broke ovens. They overturned carts. They dragged cooks by their sleeves and demanded answers with fists. Authorities responded as expected: force, suppression, punishment. But sometimes they made concessions. In Milan, the Duke lowered bread prices after cooks were assaulted and a bakery burned to the ground. In Florence, a law was passed to ensure that certain amounts of flour were distributed publicly during famine seasons, not from compassion, but from fear of more cooks hanging from gates. But even these reforms didn't erase the trauma. For cooks who survived riots, the scars were not just physical, they were emotional, psychological. Imagine preparing a pot of soup, knowing the scent could bring the wrath of a starving village. Imagine guarding flour barrels at night because mobs might come with torches. Some left the profession entirely. Others stayed silent, hiding their identity outside kitchen walls. And yet, the work continued, because hunger didn't end with a riot. After the shouting, after the blood, after the smoke, people still needed to eat, and the cook, burned and bruised, returned to the fire, because they had no choice, because the bread would be needed tomorrow, and someone had to make it. Today, we remember kings, popes, generals, but the cooks, those unsung workers of flame and flour, they lived at the axis of life and death. They were not just servants of food. In times of famine, they were symbols of hope, of excess, of injustice, and sometimes of sacrifice. So when you hold bread in your hands, soft, warm, effortless, remember, it was not always so simple. It was once the cause of chaos, of tears, of death. A crust of bread was once worth a man's life, and in some towns it was taken. Cooking with blood, the real dangers of black pudding and sausage days. In medieval kitchens, blood was not waste, it was treasure. Thick, rich, dark red. Animal blood was prized for making delicacies like black pudding, blood sausages, and blood pies. Across Europe, especially in colder regions where nothing could be spared, blood was a cornerstone of survival. But behind every savory dish made from it was a hidden cost, a slow, crimson danger that claimed cooks long before anyone tasted the first bite. On sausage days, those brutal, ritualized events when animals were slaughtered en masse to preserve meat for winter, the kitchen became a blood-soaked arena. Pigs squealed, knives flashed, buckets overflowed. Blood was collected directly from the throat, often caught in wooden pails or clay bowls, and stirred constantly with a stick to keep it from clotting too fast. If it coagulated, it was useless, but if it spilled, it was a waste, punishable by beatings. Blood had to be used within hours. There were no preservatives beyond salt and vinegar, no refrigeration, no gloves. Cooks stirred blood with bare hands, splashed it on their tunics, breathed in its iron scent until it clung to their skin. And inside this red ritual, disease festered. Blood is a rich medium for bacteria. In the heat of a medieval kitchen, it turned from ingredient to infection vector in minutes. Anthrax spores, salmonella, brucellosis. Illnesses unknown by name, but well known by their trail of symptoms. Fevers, sores, death. Kitchen staff grew ill days after sausage day, their bodies rotting from within. But no one blamed the blood. They blamed curses, sin, bad air. And yet, the tradition continued. In regions like Bavaria, England, and France, black pudding became a staple. Made from blood, fat, oats or barley, and herbs, it fed the poor and dazzled the rich. Some noble kitchens had entire days set aside for its production. These days were marked by smoke, by rot, by the shrill sound of boiling casings. Sheep stomachs, pig intestines, cleaned by hand, were stuffed with steaming red batter. boiled in copper pots, hung in cold cellars, left to ferment. But most kitchens didn't have cold cellars, and many didn't boil long enough. One cut too shallow, one boil too short, and the entire batch could become a biological weapon. Cooks died from internal infections, from fevers that scorched their minds, from wounds that never healed. A nicked finger during butchery, when covered in raw blood, was a death sentence. Still, they pressed on, because in winter, when game was scarce and meat spoiled fast, blood could be the difference between famine and life. Children were taught how to stir. Young girls trained to press sausage into casings before they could write. Families gathered for blood days, not as celebration, but survival. And the toll was paid in lesions, coughing, convulsions. If a cook lived past 40, they were lucky. Sometimes it wasn't disease that killed them, but pressure. The expectation to feed the hall, to deliver perfect blood pudding without sourness or bitterness, led to recklessness. Cooks tasted raw batter to judge spice levels. They cleaned buckets without rinsing hands. They bled animals without understanding that blood could carry plague. Records show outbreaks linked directly to blood handling practices. In the late 13th century, a monastery in the Rhineland lost 6 monks after a feast. All of them had helped prepare a blood pie for visiting nobles. It was blamed on divine punishment. But now, historians believe the pig was infected, and its blood carried the death. Still, the tradition held. In some cultures, blood was believed to carry strength. Warriors drank it. Midwives rubbed it into the skin of newborns. Cooking with it was seen as alchemy, a transformation of life force into nourishment. But in the cramped, dimly lit kitchens of Europe, that alchemy became rot. Even tools contributed to the danger. Knives weren't sterilized. Stones used to sharpen them were caked in residue. Cauldrons were cleaned with sand, not soap. Wooden bowls cracked and split, housing bacteria in their seams. The very implements used to make blood meals became silent killers. And yet, the dishes survived. Black pudding endured. Blood sausages became traditional holiday fare. Recipes traveled through generations, passed from mother to daughter, cook to apprentice, often without written word. Because for all its danger, blood was survival. Blood was culture. But in the medieval kitchen, it was also death. Slow, red, and unavoidable. And every time a cook stirred the pot, they knew. The thing that nourished could also be the thing that ended them. The toll wasn't just physical, it was emotional. Cooks lived in fear, not only of sickness, but of accusation. A noble falling ill after a meal thickened with blood could bring suspicion crashing down. And as with spoiled meats or poisoned herbs, blame was swift. A cook accused of using bad blood might be beaten, dismissed, or even executed. It didn't matter if the mistake was ignorance. In a world without modern germ theory, the line between accident and treason was drawn in blood. Still, they persisted. Every region had its secrets. Some used elderflower to counter the metallic tang. Others mixed vinegar with crushed onion to stabilize the fluid. Over time, these tricks helped lower the risks, but they were not cures. And for every cook who learned to make blood safe, another bled into the mixture without realizing it. In some towns, the smell of sausage day lingered for weeks. The scent of salt, steam, and offal became woven into the village itself. It was a season, not a day. A memory of survival painted in crimson. Today, black pudding is a delicacy. Sausage making is a craft. But few remember the cooks who died stirring boiling blood. The ones who fed kings and peasants alike, while their hands blistered, their eyes watered, and their breath steamed in kitchens that offered no thanks, only more mouths to feed. And so, beneath the history of medieval cuisine lies a darker tale of sacrifice, infection, and the bitter truth that every drop of blood used to flavor the feast once came with a cost. The cost was often the cook's own life. The apprentice curse. Young cooks who never lived to masterhood. In the shadow of the great feasting halls, far from the lords and their laughter, there was another world, hotter, harsher, and hidden. It was here, among the clanging pans and smoky hearths, that the youngest hands stirred the future. They were the apprentices, children really, boys and sometimes girls, no older than 8, entrusted with fire, iron, and wrought. Their lives were measured not in years, but in scars. And for most, those lives ended long before they ever reached the rank of master cook. To be a kitchen apprentice in medieval Europe was to be thrown into one of the most dangerous, grueling roles a child could endure. Apprenticeship often began between the ages of 8 and 10. Many were the sons of peasants or servants, handed over to castle kitchens in hopes of earning food, shelter, and the faint chance of rising in class. But what awaited them wasn't opportunity. It was survival, hour by hour, burn by burn. These children began their days before sunrise. Their tasks were menial at first, gathering wood, scrubbing floors, plucking feathers from dead birds, or fetching water from icy wells. But even these jobs were perilous. A single slip on a grease-slicked floor could land a child into open flame or onto a bed of knives. Boiling water was always nearby. Soot coated everything. Ventilation didn't exist. In time, they moved on to more skilled, but deadlier, duties. They sharpened blades nearly as long as their arms. They stirred boiling cauldrons perched on unstable tripods. They carried raw meats crawling with bacteria, unaware that every cut or scrape on their hands was an open door for infection. And they did this without gloves, without proper shoes, without any understanding of the microscopic threats slowly killing them from the inside. Injury was constant. Apprentices were burned more than any other kitchen role, not because they were careless, but because they were rushed, exhausted, or too small to control the tools they were given. If they flinched or hesitated, they were beaten. If they cried out, they were mocked. Pain was seen as education. Blood was part of the job. And then there was the rot. Food in medieval kitchens was often kept in conditions we would now consider unthinkable. Meat could be days old by the time it reached the fire. Spoiled milk, infected poultry, contaminated water. It was all handled by these children. They touched it with raw hands, breathed it in, worked beside it daily. Many developed infections we now recognize: sepsis, tetanus, dysentery, but then they were just called weak or fevered. By the time most reached their mid-teens, their bodies were already breaking down, bones twisted by malnutrition, fingers fused from repeated burns, eyes clouded by constant smoke exposure. Few made it past 30, and even fewer ever rose to the title of master cook. Some died suddenly, scalded by an overturned cauldron, sliced by a falling cleaver, crushed under collapsing beams. Others died slowly, consumed by infections that turned flesh black or lungs to sludge. There are parish records of 14-year-olds buried with hands already misshapen from arthritis, of 11-year-olds found dead behind the hearth, having collapsed from exhaustion in the middle of a shift. And still, the system continued. Because these children were cheap, replaceable. One noblewoman in a 15th century ledger noted her cook's demand for more small hands after 2 apprentices spoiled from the heat. She wasn't referring to food. She meant their minds. The children had broken under pressure, and rather than rest them, they were dismissed or buried. Some apprentice cooks tried to escape. A few fled kitchens entirely, preferring the uncertainty of wandering to the certainty of pain. Others begged their way into monasteries, hoping for cleaner kitchens and kinder masters. But most stayed, bonded either by law or poverty, slowly roasting beside the spit they once thought might feed them. And yet, despite everything, they learned. They memorized spice ratios without ever tasting the spices themselves. They mastered the timing of a roast by the sound of its drip. They knew when bread was done by scent, not color. These weren't just cooks in training, they were artists forged by fire and fear. but almost none were remembered. Unlike noble knights or court musicians, kitchen apprentices were rarely named in records. Their labor fed kings and dukes, but their existence was footnoted as the boy, the lad, or the second hand. Even the rare ones who did become full cooks often bore the legacy of the forgotten, names erased by infection, silence, and heat. The greatest irony? Many of the dishes that graced royal tables, the stews and sauces that defined a region's cuisine, were stirred first by a child's hand, a hand already blistered, already shaking, already dying. So when you imagine the medieval feast, the gleam of silver platters, the scent of roasted meats wafting through the hall, remember that behind that luxury was a child, sweating beside fire, carrying knives too large for his frame, and praying, silently, to live just one more day. He would never eat what he cooked. He would never sit at the table he served. He would never become the master he dreamed of being, because the kitchen had its own hierarchy, and the youngest always paid the highest price. The feast that killed a king's cooks. It was meant to be a celebration, a royal wedding of grandeur and loyalty, filled with pomp, guests of power, and endless courses of rich food. The bride, Eleanor of Woodstock, niece of Edward II. The occasion, her union with Reynald II of Guelders, a noble alliance bound in meat and mead. But behind the linen-draped tables and blazing torches, another fire burned. In the depths of the kitchen, amid roaring hearths and frantic hands, smoke thickened. And by the end of that day, several of the king's own cooks were dead. The kitchens at a royal feast were no place for the weak. For an event of this scale, hundreds of animals were slaughtered. Dozens of hearths blazed in unison. Spits spun with whole pigs. Pottage bubbled in iron cauldrons the size of bathtubs. Bread was pulled in rows from scorched ovens. Pies, pastries, tarts, jellied meats, roasted swans, sugared fruits. It was a display of dominion, not just cuisine. And in the center of it all stood the cooks, men who had risen through the brutal ranks of kitchen life, who had tasted smoke and sweat in equal measure. But the kitchens of Edward II's court were poorly ventilated, chimneys clogged, doors sealed against the cold February air. The smoke had nowhere to go. Eyewitness accounts suggest the firewood, green and poorly seasoned, smoked heavily, filling the underground kitchens with a slow, choking haze. Cooks shouted orders, but soon their voices broke into coughs. The apprentices tried to open doors, but in the confusion, flames leapt from one hearth to another. Panic spread faster than oxygen. Several cooks collapsed, suffocating before help arrived. Others staggered into the light, red-eyed and covered in soot, their aprons still tied, their hands blistered from fire and heat. But the feast above continued. Music played, guests toasted, plates were filled. When word reached the king, accounts differ. Some say he was enraged not at the deaths, but at the disruption. Others claim he was shaken, but in a way that turned swiftly to fury. Either way, what followed was not justice, nor grief, but silence. No official inquiry was made. The incident was never formally recorded in the king's papers. Kitchen logs went missing. Witnesses were told to remain quiet. The families of the cooks, if they were compensated at all, received no public recognition. It was as if the men had never existed. In royal courts, image was power. A death in the kitchen was not just a tragedy, it was an insult to the crown's perfection. And so, the truth was buried beneath platters of gold, wine-stained carpets, and noble laughter. But the scars remained. Whispered accounts passed between scullery boys and night porters. A servant girl told of hearing gurgling breaths as she pulled a tray of quail. A steward confessed to dragging bodies out while guests danced above. Some say the stone walls of the kitchen blackened permanently that day, never fully cleaning, no matter how hard they scrubbed. Why did so many die? Because kitchens were designed for spectacle, not safety. Fires were meant to be seen, not managed. Airflow was an afterthought. The goal was abundance, not balance. Even before this tragedy, royal kitchens were known as death traps. Cooks burned by splattering lard, crushed by collapsing shelves, or sliced by their own knives in the frenzy of preparation. And yet, they kept working. To be a royal cook was to live near danger. The prestige came with scars. A cook who served the king was more expendable than a roast bird, and they knew it. But the job fed families. It gave shelter, identity, until it didn't. In later records, vague references are made to losses during the feast, but the names of the cooks are gone, erased. No grave markers, no court mourning, no songs, only the smell of smoke rising from beneath a kingdom that preferred not to look down. It said the feast was a success, that Eleanor's wedding was a grand affair, that the king smiled, that the food was magnificent, and perhaps it was, but it was paid for in breath, and history, as always, devoured the servants before the story. The tragedy of the cooks was not the first, and it would not be the last. Throughout medieval Europe, the kitchen was a battlefield where no swords clashed, yet lives were lost. In the great halls of power, those below the salt line, the invisible barrier that separated nobles from servants, died often and anonymously. And this feast, this royal affair, became just another moment swallowed by grandeur. Later architectural reforms in some castles included the addition of wider hearths and overhead flues, but these changes came slowly, often centuries too late. In Edward's day, kitchens were usually relegated to underground or rearward wings, far from the sight of nobility. Out of sight, out of mind, out of air. Those who toiled inside them were treated as parts of a machine. They stirred, they roasted, they cleaned. But when they broke, when they collapsed from smoke or flame, they were replaced, not remembered. The king's command that no one speak of the cook's deaths was more than cruelty. It was strategy. A dead servant could not mar a royal celebration. Grief was not permitted to rise through the rafters. In the years that followed, some whispered that the feast was cursed, that guests who had eaten that night fell ill or lost their fortunes, that the bride herself wept not from joy, but from the echo of voices crying through the stone beneath her feet. There are tales that the kitchen hearth groaned at midnight, and that no cook would willingly light it alone, but these are legends, grafted onto silence. What remains true is that real men died in service, that their lungs filled with smoke in the pursuit of perfection, that heat and hunger, pressure and obedience built a world where even celebration demanded casualties. And though history turned the page, the scent of fire lingers. So the next time you hear of a royal feast, imagine not the goblets, but the coal-black corners where hands moved fast and breath came short. Imagine the silence that followed, and ask yourself, how many stories were buried with the cooks? Because even the best meal can mask a tragedy. And sometimes, the king's table is stained with more than wine. Witchcraft accusations in the kitchen. They said she stirred the pot too slowly, that her herbs smelled strange, that she whispered while she cooked. In the flickering light of medieval kitchens, such things weren't quirks, they were warnings. Because when a nobleman fell ill after a feast, when a child died after eating porridge, or when strange dreams followed a late-night stew, suspicion didn't rise toward the Lord's physician or the rotting pantry. It turned instead toward the cook, especially if she was a woman, especially if she knew things others didn't, especially if her food tasted too good. This is the forgotten truth behind many kitchen fires and silent disappearances in the Middle Ages. Superstition didn't stay outside the castle walls. It simmered alongside the soup, rising with the steam. And for those who toiled over the flames, especially women, it was a risk that could end in shackles, firewood, and whispered prayers never answered. In an age ruled by fear of the unseen, where bad weather, illness, or spoiled crops were often blamed on dark forces, It didn't take much to be marked as a witch, and kitchens were fertile ground for paranoia. Cooks handled roots, powders, brews, and mixtures few others understood. Their work was a kind of alchemy, transforming raw ingredients into something nourishing, flavorful, even intoxicating. But when things went wrong, that magic turned to menace in the minds of those who didn't understand it. Unfamiliar herbs were one of the most common triggers. Women who grew their own seasonings or collected from nearby forests were often accused of summoning strange flavors, or worse, curses. Even rosemary, sage, and thyme, now everyday kitchen staples, could raise suspicion if used in unfamiliar combinations. Add in imported spices from the East like cinnamon, cardamom, or cloves, and you had the perfect recipe for fear. Who else, people asked, but a sorceress would know how to make food smell so sweet or meat stay fresh so long? The reality was far simpler and far more tragic. These women were often deeply knowledgeable in herbalism, trained in folk medicine passed down through generations. They knew which leaves soothed pain, which roots eased fevers, and how to ferment or dry ingredients to preserve them. But that knowledge wasn't seen as skill, it was seen as unnatural, especially when the church preached that wisdom outside Scripture could only come from the devil. Accusations often began with a single incident. A lord's wife fell ill after supper. A guest had a seizure. A servant died unexpectedly. Instead of seeking spoiled meat or tainted water, the suspicion would trace backward to the kitchen, to the hands that prepared the meal, to the eyes that didn't look down quickly enough when questioned. Whispers spread. One person said the cook spoke to her pots. Another claimed she kept bones hidden behind the hearth. Soon it didn't matter if any of it was true. For women, especially widows, unmarried workers, or those who lived alone, kitchen work was one of the few ways to survive. But it was also one of the most dangerous. You weren't just feeding mouths, you were touching lives. And if those lives were later marked by tragedy, your own could be marked for destruction. Trial records from across Europe show countless examples of kitchen witches. Some were accused of bewitching bread to make it rise too quickly, others of cursing meat so it would rot. One account from 15th century Germany tells of a cook executed because she smiled while seasoning. Another from France describes a woman arrested for summoning laughter at a noble feast, only to be accused days later when the Lord's daughter fell ill with fever. Torture was the usual tool of confession. Under enough pain, any woman would admit to anything. They'd confess to speaking with demons, to cursing the stew, to stirring widdershins when no one was watching. They'd name herbs they never touched, say spells they never spoke. And once the words were out, there was no return. Execution was often the next step, burned at the stake, or hanged in a public square while townsfolk muttered prayers against the devil's influence. But even surviving an accusation could destroy a life. Women were cast out, starved, or left to wander, marked by rumor, unemployable. Other cooks, terrified of guilt by association, stripped their recipes of creativity. Kitchens became quieter, colder places. Risky herbs disappeared from menus. Spices went unused. Innovation died, replaced by bland tradition enforced by fear. And yet, even in the shadows of fear, some resisted. Some hid their herbs behind false walls. Some cooked in secret for those brave enough to risk a real meal. And in a few rare places, small villages, remote manors, people protected their cooks. They knew the difference between witchcraft and wisdom. But they were rare voices in a world where fear boiled faster than broth. It's easy now in our modern kitchens to forget that food once meant danger, that the women who stirred the pot once risked their lives with every pinch of spice, every unlabeled leaf, every healing brew mistaken for a curse. Their names are mostly lost, erased by ash, erased by fear. But their legacy is in every recipe passed down without explanation, every dish that tastes of memory, every herb garden tended in silence. They weren't witches, they were cooks. healers, innovators, survivors of a time when the worst crime a woman could commit was knowing too much about what fed the world. The smell that never left. Cooks and the curse of grease. Smoke. The medieval cook did not just work with fire, they lived inside it. Day after day, they stepped into kitchens not built for comfort, but for consumption. And what consumed them wasn't just heat, it was something far more insidious. Grease, smoke, fat. It clung to them, not just their clothes, but their lungs, their pores, their memory. And in time, it didn't just mark them, it broke them. Imagine stepping into a medieval kitchen. There's no ventilation, no chimney strong enough to swallow what's rising. The air is thick, fogged with the vapor of dripping tallow, sizzling pork, and boiling stock. Every pan releases a ghost, and it doesn't float away. It settles. It lingers. It becomes a second skin. The cook moves through it like a diver through water, eyes burning, throat raw, hands already sweating before the fire's even stoked. Most of the fuel used wasn't clean-burning wood. It was charcoal, peat, or even dung, each of which left behind a thick, choking smoke that mingled with airborne grease. The fats, rendered from boar, lamb, and goose, spattered in open pans and spit-fired roasts, launching droplets into the air. That oil didn't just coat the food, it settled on every surface. Walls became sticky, ceilings glistened, the floor turned into a slick trap waiting to snap bones. And the cook, caught in the middle of it all, breathed every molecule of it, hour after hour, year after year. There were no aprons strong enough to block it. Linen shirts stained yellow from absorbed smoke. Wool tunics became stiff with congealed fat. No matter how many times they were washed, if they were washed at all, the smell never left. It lived in the fibers. The cook could walk through a market, a chapel, even their own home, and people would turn. Not because they recognized them, but because the air around them told a story. The story of a body cooked in its own labor. The skin, exposed daily to radiant heat and vaporized oil, began to blister and peel. Redness became permanent. Sores that started as minor burns turned into weeping wounds, easily infected in an age with no antiseptics. But it was the lungs that suffered most. Coughs became constant companions. Breath came shallow. Long before modern medicine had a name for it, these cooks developed what we'd now call chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or worse. Their death came slowly and with every exhale. Blackened lungs, wheezing sleep, the taste of iron in the throat, all from years of inhaling the byproduct of their craft. And yet, they kept cooking, because food still needed fire, and fire still made smoke. In castle kitchens, where meals for hundreds were prepared, the smoke was so dense that even with high ceilings and venting grates, visibility dropped to near blindness. Many kitchens built separate towers or side halls to reduce the danger of smoke-killing servants in their sleep. But the cook never got that protection. They stood closest to the source, the center of the storm. In smaller homes and inns, things were even worse. Cooking often took place in a single-room dwelling where the same fire heated both food and family. Cooks who doubled as mothers, fathers, or tavern keepers endured the choking atmosphere not just for hours, but for life. Children raised around the hearth often developed similar lung problems early on, inheriting the curse of the kitchen before they could even speak. The grease wasn't just in the air, it was in their blood. The constant exposure changed them. Some cooks would describe a faint burning in their sinuses that never faded. Others lost the ability to taste subtle flavors, their senses dulled by years of saturation. Their sweat smelled of smoke. Their touch left behind a trace of animal fat, no matter how much they scrubbed. Few recipes were written down, but the scent, rancid lard, charred marrow, wet ash, was imprinted in their being. Some medieval texts even mention how visitors could identify a cook not by title, but by smell. Even in death, it lingered. Cooks were sometimes buried with their aprons or blades, But what mourners remembered most wasn't the tools they left behind. It was the odor that hovered above the coffin, a grim perfume earned over a lifetime of feeding others while poisoning themselves. In religious orders, some monks assigned to the kitchen as penance spoke of it as a spiritual trial, not just the labor, but the stink. The constant smoke was seen as a test of humility, of endurance. In their journals, you find phrases like, "the air that sins cling to," or "God's fire leaves soot on the soul." They weren't being poetic. They were describing a daily war with the very medium they served. There was no glamour in the job, no reward, no safe distance between the body and the flame. And yet, these cooks, ignored in the histories of kings and councils, were essential. They fed armies. They sustained cities. They kept families alive through winter and war, and they did it while suffocating. Today, we talk of kitchen fatigue, of restaurant stress, of back-of-house burnout. But once upon a time, it was literal. The burnout came from the lungs, from the skin, from the soul. The medieval cook didn't just serve the meal, they became part of it. Sacrificed slowly, one breath at a time, to grease, smoke, and fire. So the next time you savor a roasted dish or smell the comfort of something cooking over flame, think of them. The ones who smelled like their work, who couldn't escape it, who carried their kitchens with them, into town, into sleep, into death. The scent they wore wasn't a choice, it was a sentence, and it never left. Kitchen spies, servants, who were paid to eavesdrop. In the great stone castles of medieval Europe, power didn't only change hands through war. Sometimes it changed through whispers, carried on the steam rising from kitchen pots, passed between servants bent over stew, spoken behind barrels and bread ovens. And the most dangerous place in the castle wasn't the throne room, it was the kitchen, because some of those cooks weren't just servants, they were spies. In a world where warfare often relied on information more than force, invading armies and rival nobles quickly realized that the quickest path to a man's secrets, or his death, ran straight through his plate. The kitchen offered something no battlefield ever could: proximity. Unnoticed, unguarded, underestimated. And so cooks were bribed, threatened, bought, or broken. Some agreed. A few copper coins to pass along a rumor, a pouch of silver to slip something into the Lord's wine. Others refused, and were found drowned in well buckets or burned in accidents involving boiling lard. Treason, in the medieval kitchen, wasn't just a possibility, it was a profession. Every noble feared betrayal, and yet most ignored the threat that cooked their meals, carried their plates, and cleaned their goblets. Cooks heard everything: who visited whom, who ate alone, who drank too much, who trusted too easily. And in the background of every royal strategy, every whispered alliance or false treaty, stood someone in a soot-black tunic, pretending not to listen. The cook's access was unparalleled. They moved freely between hall and cellar, chapel and chamber. They knew what spices a lord preferred, what herbs he feared, what meat made him ill. Some even knew which cup was his favorite, which bowl he used when he mourned, and that made them more dangerous than soldiers. In the 12th century, a cook in the employ of a minor English earl was found guilty of selling information to the Welsh. He passed military movement details hidden in flour sacks delivered to merchants outside the city. When caught, he claimed he only wanted better pay. The court hanged him within the hour, but the damage was done. The rival army knew where the garrisons would move weeks before they arrived. Not all were volunteers. Some were coerced, their families held hostage, their lives threatened, and when they refused, their deaths were slow. A female cook in a Bohemian court was beaten in front of the staff after refusing to poison a nobleman's rival. She died 3 days later from internal injuries, and her name was never recorded. Her crime? Loyalty. Other spies were more subtle. They gathered information for foreign courts, not poisoners but listeners. They reported troop counts, construction updates, wedding plans, anything that could be used as leverage. They were paid in coin, silk, or sometimes simply in safe passage to a better life. The most dangerous kitchen wasn't the one that served the king, it was the one that fed his enemies. During the Hundred Years' War, both French and English monarchs suspected their food staff of treachery. Cooks were replaced frequently. Tasting rituals grew elaborate. Some lords had dishes sent ahead to remote testers. Yet still, they died. And every time, the kitchen was interrogated first. In some courts, it became custom to hire cooks from rival kingdoms as an act of control, hostages with knives. One Venetian noble preferred foreign chefs so that he could keep their families under guard, ensuring obedience. Another duke from Burgundy demanded his servants be illiterate, believing that information couldn't be passed if it couldn't be written. He underestimated the power of memory. A servant once reported hearing a conversation about a planned military alliance between neighboring families. He told a cook, who passed it to an envoy for coin. That alliance crumbled before it began, and the cook disappeared the next day, presumed dead. But the silence bought a castle another year of peace. The kitchen became its own battlefield. Alliances were forged between butlers and bakers. Secrets passed through honey cakes and bottles of mead. One spilled pot of soup could signal sabotage. One missing knife could be the start of an assassination. And cooks, those invisible hands, stood always on the edge of treason. One wrong word, one overheard sentence, one refusal. That's all it took. In many castles, fear of espionage reshaped entire kitchens. Some rulers demanded that all staff be replaced monthly. Others employed deaf-mute cooks, convinced that if you couldn't speak, you couldn't spill secrets. But fear didn't stop the whispers. It only buried them deeper. In cellars and behind barrels, alliances formed in silence. The knives they used to slice meat could just as easily slice truth. And once a rumor reached the ear of an outsider, it became a weapon. It didn't even have to be true. A single planted rumor, shared through a kitchen servant to a guard, then to a traveler, could spark suspicion, exile, even war. In Spain, it was said that one queen's cook helped leak details of her fertility treatments. The noble court turned on her within weeks. In Scandinavia, a suspected kitchen spy was found with notes written in pig's blood, messages smeared into dried hides, tucked under loaves of bread. The ingenuity of kitchen spies was unmatched. Some baked codes into pies. Others stitched messages into towel seams or tied knots in bread dough as signals. Each method more desperate than the last. And when caught, punishment was merciless. Not just execution. Examples. Cooks were hanged over the castle gate. Their hands were nailed to chopping blocks. One was force-fed his own poisoned stew. Another was buried with the utensils he used, as a warning to every servant that came after. But the greatest fear wasn't the cook who spied. It was the one who didn't speak, who didn't blink, who just listened. Because listening was power, and in the dark kitchens of medieval power, silence was the deadliest tool of all. Bread with gravel, the tooth-breaking reality of castle baking. In the towering kitchens of medieval castles, where spit-roasted beasts turned slowly over open fires and cauldrons simmered with broth, one item appeared on every table, from noble banquets to servant meals: bread. But the bread of the Middle Ages was not the warm, soft comfort we imagine today. It was often hard, coarse, and laced with an invisible enemy: stone dust. For thousands of mouths across Europe, bread wasn't just food, it was a dental death sentence. The problem lay not in the baking, but in the grinding. Flour in the Middle Ages was produced using rotary millstones, usually made of rough granite or sandstone. Grain was poured between two stones, one fixed, the other rotated, and ground into flour by brute force. But the friction between the stones caused them to erode. Tiny fragments of the millstones flaked off and mixed into the flour itself. This stone dust was invisible to the eye, undetectable by taste, and entirely inescapable. By the time it reached the cook's hands, The flour already carried the seeds of ruin. And the cooks knew. They could feel the grit as they kneaded. They saw the dust settle as they sifted, and they watched guests, especially the elderly, wince in pain after biting down. But what choice did they have? Bread was a staple. It wasn't just an accessory to a meal, it was the meal, often served 3 times a day. Without it, people went hungry. And so, the cooks baked on, knowing each loaf was laced with silent damage. Historical records show that dental decay, cracked molars, and even shattered jawbones were shockingly common by the age of 30. Archaeological digs of medieval graveyards consistently reveal worn-down teeth with deep grooves, evidence not of sugar consumption, but of constant exposure to grit. Some skulls show molars ground almost flat. Others display abscesses so severe they likely caused death from infection. And the culprit, again and again, was the bread. This wasn't just a peasant problem. Even the nobility, though they had access to finer sieved flours, like bolted white bread, still suffered. Millstones affected all grain equally. Only the richest, those with imported flour or dedicated millers, could hope to avoid the gravel curse entirely. But for everyone else, from castle servants to squires and stewards, biting into bread could mean chipping a tooth or beginning a slow, painful spiral into dental rot. Cooks tried to adapt. Some attempted to sift the flour more thoroughly, though sieves were crude and stone dust could pass through undetected. Others added water or milk to soften the dough, hoping to produce a less abrasive bite. But such methods did little. The core ingredient remained flawed. The bread, brown, dense, and thick, bore the same hidden grit. And every bite was a gamble. One 14th century record from a Welsh manor notes that the kitchen cook was whipped for the cracking of Lord Briel's tooth after the nobleman broke a molar during supper. The bread was blamed. The cook, however, paid the price. Another entry in a Flemish kitchen ledger warned staff to knead with care and with mercy, an oddly poetic instruction that in context likely meant try not to make bread that kills. But the danger went beyond broken teeth. As people aged, untreated dental trauma led to horrific infections. With no antibiotics and rudimentary surgical tools, a rotted tooth could trigger facial swelling, brain abscesses, or septic death. And it all began with the daily loaf. In monasteries where bread was made in massive communal ovens, monks often developed early tooth loss. The cloisters kept careful records, and many mention brothers unable to eat meat or given broth in place of loaf due to mouth injuries. Some even developed systems of soaking bread in ale or milk to soften it, an act of mercy as much as nourishment. Even among children, the damage started early. Young apprentices who stole pieces of bread while working in kitchens often ended up with damaged teeth before adulthood. By 12, some had blackened gums. By 20, many were already toothless. The nickname, "black bread smile," appeared in parts of England and France, referencing the distinct gaps and worn teeth common among bakers and kitchen hands. And yet, bread remained sacred. It was the food most often blessed, most often shared, and most often remembered in writing. Chronicles speak of grand banquets with silver platters, but always note the bread. It was so central to survival that even when it hurt, people kept eating it. They had to. In famine years, bread grew worse. When wheat was scarce, millers mixed in acorns, dried peas, or even powdered bark, further toughening the dough. The already dangerous loaves became near lethal. Entire communities chewed slowly, carefully, knowing that one wrong bite could split a tooth and that a split tooth could end in death. And for the cooks, their hands bled from kneading rough dough, their nails wore down from mixing, and they carried the guilt of every injury they caused, but they kept baking because they had no choice. The lords demanded bread, the servants needed it, and hunger was louder than pain. So the next time you tear into a soft, modern loaf, remember that centuries ago, A child apprentice may have woken at dawn to grind stone-filled flour by hand, that a cook may have wept in frustration as another noble spat out blood, that a woman feeding her family knew the bread she baked could shorten her child's life, but baked it anyway. Bread was sustenance. Bread was survival. But in the castles of Europe, it was also grit, gravel, and quiet agony. And every loaf, no matter how golden, came with a hidden toll carved into the teeth of history. The fire that took the feast and the kitchen. The feast was meant to honor peace. In 1381, within the thick stone walls of a Welsh castle, a banquet was underway. Lords and clergy gathered in opulence, feasting in a hall lit by hundreds of candles and warmed by the heat of a dozen ovens. The kitchens were alive with clatter and fire, roasting meats and boiling broths for nobles wrapped in fur and silk. Below the laughter and harp-strings, servants moved like clockwork in the hidden chambers of labor. But one spark, one slip, set it all ablaze. The fire began not in the hall, but in the belly of the castle, the kitchen. A cauldron of oil, used to deep-fry game birds for the main course, was tipped during the rush of preparation. Accounts say a boy, likely no older than 12, stumbled while carrying a spit. The flaming oil splashed onto timber supports, and the fire caught fast. Within moments, smoke poured through the vents and cracks in the floor above. Medieval kitchens were designed for heat retention, not escape. Walls were stone, but rafters were wood. Floors littered with straw to prevent slipping became kindling. Oil-fed flames moved quickly, leaping from one preparation station to the next. Servants tried to douse it with water, but the moment water hit the oil, the fire exploded upward, coating ceiling beams in a roiling plume of flame. Panic set in. Some ran for the exits. Others tried to form chains, throwing wet sacks and cloaks against the blaze. But by then, it was too late. The fire spread from the kitchen to the scullery, from the scullery to the servant quarters. Cramped wooden sleeping lofts ignited like torches. Those resting between shifts were trapped before they could scream. Witnesses from the upper hall said the first signs were the scent, char, oil, hair. Then came the sound, cracking beams, screams below. A castle feast turned into a rising horror, and yet the lords didn't flee, not immediately. Some thought it a distraction. Others, insulted by panic, ordered servants to investigate before leaving their wine. By the time the alarm reached the outer courtyard, smoke was billowing from beneath the castle like a dragon's breath. Guards formed lines with buckets, but the heat forced them back. Dozens of servants died below, many not burned, but suffocated by smoke in the narrow halls. Others collapsed, trying to rescue those still trapped. In total, records suggest more than 30 kitchen staff and servants were killed that day, though the exact number was never verified. Bodies were too badly burned to count. Some were buried together in an unmarked pit behind the castle wall. The nobility mourned the loss of the structure, the damage to their feast, their heirlooms, their tapestries. Few mourned the staff. Fire in a medieval castle was nightmare incarnate. Despite the stone walls, interiors were filled with combustible materials: hay-stuffed mattresses, oiled linens, wooden beams, and dried herbs hanging from ceilings. One fire could take an entire estate. It was the silent enemy of the servant class, who worked closest to the flame and bore the brunt of its wrath. In the aftermath, the kitchens were rebuilt, but never fully repaired. Superstition took hold. Some said the castle was cursed, that the feast, designed to celebrate a fragile political truce, had offended the spirits. Cooks swore they heard moaning at night. Some refused to enter the new kitchens alone. It's said that in winters after, fires lit in the new hearths would gutter and die without reason. But what truly lingered was the silence. Like so many tragedies in servant spaces, it faded from official history. The records describe a great fire. They mention loss of goods. Nowhere are the names of those lost recorded. No headstones, no eulogies, just ash. In 1381, England was already reeling from the peasants' revolt. The idea of servants dying en masse, suffering for the comfort of the elite, was not something the court wanted publicized. The king's men were instructed to suppress rumors. What mattered was stability, not the cost, not the cooks, but some memories refused to die. Oral histories in Wales speak of the fire that took the feast and the kitchen. Elders pass down stories of the boy who spilled the cauldron, and the maid who ran back for her sister and never returned. They tell of the steward who burned his hands pulling a cook from the flames, only to succumb days later from infection. Their names live only in breath now, in tale, in whisper, and yet the truth lingers. The fire that started with a single mistake consumed more than a kitchen. It took lives. It took stories. It took a piece of a world that built castles but forgot the hands that kept them warm. So the next time you imagine a medieval feast, remember not just the music or the gold-lit halls. Remember the fire beneath, the people below. The tragedy that climbed upward, hidden in smoke, until it touched the hem of power and vanished. Because in 1381, the fire that fed the feast swallowed the very hands that prepared it. A cook's death was never mourned, the invisible class of the castle. They died with their hands stained by broth, by fire, by blood, but no one sang for them. In the long, brutal life of a medieval castle, death was common, but remembrance was not equal. When a knight fell in battle, bards composed verses. When a lady died, her face was painted in soft oils. But when a cook died, burned alive by boiling fat, crushed under barrels of wine, or poisoned by food he never meant to taste, there was no elegy, no name carved, no story told. Cooks were the castle's lifeblood, but they were never seen as its soul. They worked in the back, beneath stone and soot, closer to the rats than to royalty. Their world was one of smoke-choked halls, slippery floors, heavy iron, and flame. They bled without glory. They suffered without pause, and when they perished, whether from exhaustion, infection, or terrible accident, they were replaced, quietly, immediately. You won't find their names in family records or chronicles. Most were illiterate. Most were poor. Many were women, children, or former criminals who took up the apron as a last resort. And yet, without them, the castle would have starved. The feast would have never begun. Their deaths were frequent and often gruesome. Fires in medieval kitchens burned constantly, fueled by open hearths, grease, and wooden utensils. One slip, one overturned pot, and the result was catastrophic. Skin blistered, clothes ignited. The smell of burned flesh became so familiar in some kitchens that it barely slowed the preparation of the next meal. Boiling water spilled, cauldrons tipped, oil exploded onto bare skin. And those who screamed did so not out of shock, but out of the knowledge that the pain wouldn't be their final suffering. It was only the start. Crushed fingers, broken backs, smoke inhalation, rats carrying disease. Even the act of lifting massive pots, day after day, led to twisted spines and shattered joints. Many cooks worked while limping, coughing, or bleeding, because rest wasn't granted to the invisible. If one fell, another took their place. If one died, their body was carried out before the Lord's Supper, never during, never with interruption. Poison was a rarer but darker death. In a world of political games and assassinations, cooks often bore the blame when a nobleman died of tainted food. Some were executed as scapegoats. Others were murdered outright, poisoned themselves by the very dishes meant for others. And even when they were innocent, suspicion alone was enough to erase them from memory. No one defended the cook. Few even remembered their face. They were essential and entirely expendable. No portraits, no tombs, no ballads whispered by candlelight. Their bones lie in unmarked earth, perhaps behind castle walls or beneath the kitchens they once kept warm. Their deaths were treated like broken tools, regrettable but unremarkable. Yet even so, their work lingered. The meals they crafted nourished kings. The flavors they built shaped generations. Recipes stolen from them made their way into the courts, onto scrolls, into noble mouths. They labored in silence, and history rewarded them with the same. There were moments, rare and dim, where another servant might whisper their name, where a kitchen hand might light a single candle and leave it burning by the hearth, a small act of mourning in a place that had no room for grief. But such moments faded with the ash. And what of the children who worked beside them? The orphans who stoked fires too large for their bodies? The girls whose hands blistered from scrubbing pots as tall as themselves? They too died in kitchens, scalded, beaten, starved. Their stories never reached the light of day. The class divide wasn't just felt in life, it echoed through death. The knight's body was paraded, armored, and flower-draped. The cook's corpse was carted out the servant's door before rigor mortis could set in, because rot was a threat to the feast, and the feast was always more important than the hands that made it. Imagine standing in one of those ancient kitchens now. The soot still clings to the stone. The fireplace is cold, but the scorch marks are there. You breathe in the silence and realize it's not empty. It's full of ghosts who never got names. They were not martyrs. They were not heroes, but they were human. They laughed over scraps. They whispered old recipes. They cursed the lords. They dreamed maybe once of something better. And then they died, alone, unseen, and quickly forgotten. But every great hall built in stone, every banquet immortalized in text, every royal family that dined through plague and war, stood on the backs of cooks who lived and died in the shadow of the fire. Their lives weren't written down, but their absence was always felt, whenever the food was late, whenever the bread fell flat, whenever the flavor didn't sing. And in that absence, maybe, their ghosts whispered a final truth. You never noticed us, but without us, your whole world would have starved.